CTV's Judy Trin now with the Mexican response and the growing risk for Canada. Judy.
Heather, Eurasia Group, a global advisory firm, says that Canada may be the nation most profoundly impacted by U.S. foreign policy this year. Donald Trump claimed the capture of Nicolas Maduro was about stopping narco-terrorism. Now Trump is signaling he may send American troops onto Mexican soil.
We've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by water, and we are going to start now hitting land with regard to the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico.
Este plan de acción.
Mexico has previously turned down Trump's offer of military intervention, but is concerned Trump will act on his own, like he did in Venezuela.
In Europe, Denmark's prime minister says the nation is at a, quote, fateful moment as Trump repeatedly threatens to take over Greenland. Mette Frederiksen accused Washington of potentially turning its back on NATO and says Trump's push to acquire the Danish territory puts her country at a crossroads ahead of a high-stakes meeting this week between the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will, and I'm not letting that happen. We're talking about acquiring, not leasing, not having it short term. We're talking about acquiring. And if we don't do it, Russia or China will, and that's not going to happen when I'm president.
Are you going to increase the amount of military bases on Greenland in the meantime?
Well, we have bases on Greenland. Yeah.
Are you going to make more?
I can put a lot of soldiers there right now if I want, but you need more than that. You need ownership. You really need title, as they say in the real estate.
Trump's own Republicans just voted to strip his war powers while he threatens military action against 2 U.S. allies. Susan Collins gets a profanity-laced phone call from Trump after crossing party lines. This isn't normal political disagreement. This is constitutional crisis territory. We're looking at 3 fronts happening simultaneously: military threats against Denmark over Greenland, potential strikes on Mexico over cartels, and a Venezuelan emergency declaration that came at the exact moment his party revolted. This is a stress test of American democracy happening in real time. The Republican Revolt explained. Here's what actually happened because the headlines don't capture the full picture. Last week, enough Republicans crossed party lines to advance a war powers resolution that would restrict Trump's ability to take unilateral military action. Not Democrats alone, Republicans. The same party that's supposed to have his back just voted to limit his authority to deploy American forces without congressional approval. Why would they do that? Because of statements coming from this White House that have made even loyal supporters deeply uncomfortable. Trump has publicly entertained using military force to acquire Greenland. Let me be clear about what that means. Greenland isn't some unclaimed territory. It's part of Denmark, a NATO ally, a country we are treaty-bound to defend. Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in stark terms, explaining that any military move against Greenland would theoretically place America in conflict with the entire NATO alliance. Article 5, the collective defense principle, would be triggered. We would be attacking an ally. But that's not the only front. Trump is also signaling possible military strikes on Mexican soil against cartels. Mexico has previously turned down Trump's offers of military intervention, but he's making it clear he might act unilaterally anyway. The White House even posted on social media, warning Mexico to F around and find out. This isn't diplomatic language. This is threat language. And here's where it gets really concerning for folks watching from Canada. According to CTV News reporting, Eurasia Group says Canada may be the nation most profoundly impacted by U.S. foreign policy this year. Why? Because when Trump started talking about fentanyl flows across borders earlier this year, he lumped Canada and Mexico into the same basket. The U.S. has declared 8 cartels terror organizations, 7 of them based in Mexico. During his meeting with Justin Trudeau last September, the Prime Minister acknowledged some of them operate in Canada too. So Republican senators are looking at this pattern. military threats against Denmark, military threats against Mexico, emergency declarations that bypass Congress. And they're doing the math. They're realizing that if they stay silent now, they're setting a precedent that any future president can point to and say Congress didn't object then. Why should they object now? That's how norms die. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet acquiescence that accumulates until the exception becomes the rule. The War Powers Act exists precisely for moments like this. It was passed after Vietnam, after years of presidential military action without proper congressional authorization. It was designed to ensure that the decision to send Americans into combat would never rest with one person alone. When Trump learned that members of his own party had moved against him on something this fundamental, the response wasn't negotiation. It wasn't persuasion. It was fury. The phone call to Senator Collins reportedly included shouting, profanity, and threats. The kind of reaction that tells you everything about how this president views dissent, not as democracy functioning, but as personal betrayal. But here's what's really significant about this moment. This revolt is coming from inside the party. Democrats opposing Trump is expected. Republicans doing so on fundamental questions of war powers and presidential authority is a structural shift that wasn't happening 6 months ago. Something has changed in the calculation. These lawmakers are looking at their own legacies, their own states, their own constitutional oaths, and they're asking, what do I want to be remembered for? Waving through every decision without question, or standing up when it mattered. The timing here matters too. At the exact moment Republicans are pushing back on war powers, Trump declares a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets. Emergencies allow presidents to bypass normal legislative processes. They centralize authority. They shift public attention. And right now, this administration has a lot of attention it might want to shift because transparency promises are stalling and Inspector General requests are piling up. This isn't political theater. This is the president's own party actively moving to strip away powers he's trying to use while he simultaneously threatens military action against allied territory. The system is being stress tested, and some Republicans have decided the system is worth defending, even from their own president. The emergency powers pattern. Now, let's talk about how emergency powers actually work, because this Venezuelan oil declaration isn't happening in a vacuum. When presidents declare emergencies, they gain access to expanded authorities that bypass normal congressional oversight. They can redirect funds, invoke special provisions, and act with reduced legislative input. It's a legitimate tool when used appropriately for natural disasters, genuine security threats, situations requiring rapid response that Congress couldn't authorize quickly enough. But it's also a tool that can be weaponized. And when you declare an emergency over Venezuelan oil assets at the exact moment your own party is revolting against your war powers, the timing raises serious questions. Is this about energy security? Or is it about changing the subject? Is this about protecting American interests? Or is it about reasserting dominance when that dominance feels threatened? Here's the pattern I need you to see. Every time scrutiny increases on this administration, crisis rhetoric escalates. Questions about transparency? Declare an emergency about oil. Congressional pushback on war powers? Escalate rhetoric about national security threats? Internal party revolt? Frame it as establishment betrayal and double down on loyalty tests. It's not random, it's systematic. And the Venezuelan emergency fits this pattern perfectly. The practical benefits of this declaration are distant and uncertain. They would primarily flow to multinational energy companies rather than American consumers. But the political benefits are immediate. Emergency declarations centralize presidential authority. They shift news cycles. They create the appearance of decisive action during moments of political vulnerability. Look at what else is happening right now that this emergency conveniently overshadows. Transparency initiatives that were promised, emphasized, and prioritized have moved far more slowly than rhetoric suggested. Document releases that were supposed to demonstrate integrity have stalled. Lawmakers like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse have begun publicly describing these delays, emphasizing timelines, compliance requirements, and the gap between what was promised and what has been delivered. Inspector General requests have been filed not as accusations, but as acknowledgments that something in the process isn't working the way it should. These are the boring, technical, unglamorous tools of accountability. War powers resolutions, oversight requests, Inspector General reviews. And they're all being activated simultaneously while emergency declarations pile up. This is what people miss when they focus on the drama instead of the mechanics. For a president who treats control as essential to survival, oversight is threatening because oversight produces records. Records don't care about spin. Records don't respond to intimidation. Records just exist, quietly documenting what actually happened. And that documentation is what Trump seems most eager to outrun. The Venezuelan emergency serves multiple purposes. It demonstrates action during a moment of internal rebellion. It provides legal authorities that might prove useful later. It generates headlines that crowd out less favorable stories. And it establishes precedent for future emergency declarations when political pressure mounts. But here's what should concern everyone about this pattern. Emergency powers aren't just policy tools, they're constitutional tools. When they get used as political weapons, rather than genuine crisis responses, they degrade the entire system. Because future presidents inherit every precedent that gets set now, every emergency declaration that Congress waves through without scrutiny becomes part of the toolkit available to whoever comes next. That's why some Republicans are finally pushing back. Not just on this emergency, but on the pattern itself. They're recognizing that protecting the institution sometimes means opposing the person who currently runs it. They're doing the math on what unlimited emergency authority looks like in the hands of any president, not just this one. The calculation is shifting from short-term loyalty to long-term institutional damage. And that shift is what's driving the revolt we're seeing play out in real time. Because once you normalize emergency powers as political tools, once you accept that presidents can bypass Congress whenever they feel challenged, you've fundamentally altered the balance of power in American government. This Venezuelan declaration isn't just about oil, it's about testing whether Congress will continue to acquiesce to emergency authority being used as a political escape hatch whenever oversight gets uncomfortable. The broader stakes and precedent. What most people don't grasp about this moment is that we're not just watching a political fight. We're watching the creation of precedents that will outlast this presidency by decades. Every power that goes unchallenged now, every norm that breaks without consequence, every emergency declaration that Congress waves through becomes part of the permanent toolkit available to future presidents. Think about that for a second. Whatever you think of Trump personally, he won't be president forever. Eventually, there will be a different person in that office, and that person will inherit every precedent being set right now. If a Republican president can threaten military action against NATO allies without meaningful pushback, what stops a Democratic president from doing the same, or something worse? This is what constitutional scholars have been warning about for years, and it's what's finally breaking through the partisan fog in some Republican minds. The realization that defending the institution sometimes means opposing the person who currently runs it. Because precedents don't have party affiliations. They just exist. And once they exist, they're very hard to undo. Look at what Trump told the New York Times in that recent interview. He said he's not constrained by international law or Congress but by his own morality. That's the only thing that can stop him, according to his own words. Let that sink in. The President of the United States is publicly stating that legal constraints don't apply to him. Only his personal judgment matters. That's not how constitutional government works. The whole system is built on the principle that no one person's judgment is sufficient to wield unlimited power. That's why we have checks and balances, separation of powers, treaty obligations, and congressional oversight. These aren't suggestions. They're the foundation of everything. But when you have a president who openly rejects those constraints, who treats every limit as a personal insult, who responds to dissent with fury and intimidation, you're not dealing with normal political disagreement anymore. You're dealing with someone who fundamentally misunderstands what presidential power is supposed to be. And the international implications are staggering. Denmark's prime minister says her nation is at a fateful moment as Trump threatens to take over Greenland. She's accused Washington of potentially turning its back on NATO. Think about what that means. Our oldest and most reliable allies are questioning whether American commitments mean anything anymore. NATO allies are having emergency discussions about Arctic defense, not because of Russian or Chinese threats, but because of American threats. That's unprecedented. When your allies have to defend against you rather than with you, you've broken something fundamental about how international relations work. The scholar Jan Oberg put it perfectly when he said we're facing something fundamentally new, where old international politics and political science concepts no longer cover what's going on. We're into psychology, militarism, emotionalism, and he will do what he wants to do because he has a stronger military than any other country in the world. That's the brutal reality allies are grappling with. Military might without legal constraints. Power without accountability. And they're responding by reconsidering partnerships that have lasted for generations. For Canada specifically, this creates an impossible situation. Eurasia Group warns that Canada may be the nation most profoundly impacted by U.S. foreign policy this year. Why? Because Canada gets caught in the crossfire of every American decision without having any real influence over those decisions. When Trump threatens Mexico over cartels, Canada gets dragged in because some of those same cartels operate across the Canadian border. When Trump talks about fentanyl flows, he lumps Canada and Mexico together as equally problematic. When Trump destabilizes NATO relationships, Canada loses its most important security partnership. The ripple effects hit regular people in ways that aren't always visible. Market volatility because investors can't predict policy. Business hesitation to hire or expand because rules might change overnight. Supply chain disruptions because trade relationships become unstable. Retirement accounts dipping because markets are nervous about geopolitical chaos. These connections aren't theoretical. They're happening right now. And they're why constitutional guardrails matter beyond courtrooms and the Capitol. The rules that govern presidential power exist precisely to create stability, to ensure that no matter who holds the office, there are boundaries that protect the system from being captured by any single individual's impulses. When those boundaries get tested, when they might actually break, everyone feels it eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not in the headlines you scroll past, but in the accumulated weight of uncertainty that settles over a country losing confidence in its own institutions. Republicans doing the math are realizing this isn't about protecting Trump anymore. It's about protecting the system itself. Because once you normalize unlimited presidential authority, once you accept that emergency powers can be used as political weapons, once you agree that international law doesn't apply to American presidents, you've created a monster that any future president can unleash. The system under stress. This brings us to the fundamental question we're all living through right now. Are we a nation of laws where power is genuinely constrained by constitutional limits? Or are we something else entirely? A nation where laws exist on paper but bend in practice whenever someone powerful enough decides to push against them? That question doesn't get answered once. It gets answered over and over through thousands of decisions made by lawmakers, judges, voters, and citizens who pay attention when it would be easier to look away. And right now, we're getting some of those answers in real time. The boring procedural machinery of accountability is finally engaging. War powers resolutions, oversight requests, inspector general reviews. These aren't dramatic tools. They're not made for television, but they're the actual mechanisms through which constitutional government either functions or fails. What makes this moment different from previous political dramas is that the institutional guardrails are being activated not just by the opposition party, but by members of the president's own party. That's significant because it suggests the stress on the system has reached a level where partisan loyalty can't override constitutional concerns. The War Powers Act exists for exactly this scenario. It was designed after Vietnam to ensure that no president could commit American forces to combat without proper congressional authorization. When Republicans vote to advance that resolution, they're not just opposing Trump. They're defending the principle that Congress has a role in deciding when and how America goes to war. Similarly, Inspector General reviews exist to provide independent oversight when normal political processes break down. When senators request those reviews, they're acknowledging that something in the system isn't working the way it should, and they need neutral professionals to figure out what went wrong. These tools work slowly and methodically. They don't generate exciting headlines, but they accumulate into real accountability over time. The question is whether that accumulation happens fast enough to matter, or whether the precedents being set now outpace the institutional response. History suggests institutions can defend themselves when enough people choose to make them work. But history also shows that requires sustained effort, not just isolated votes or symbolic gestures. The next several months will reveal which pattern this follows, whether we're seeing genuine institutional reassertion or just temporary turbulence that fades once the immediate controversy passes. What we're watching isn't just about this presidency. It's about whether the system itself remains capable of functioning, adapting, and self-correcting when it faces someone who treats every constitutional limit as a personal attack. Conclusion. 3 key takeaways from this crisis. First, the internal revolt represents a structural shift that wasn't happening 6 months ago. Republicans are finally choosing institutional protection over party loyalty. Second, emergency powers are being weaponized as political tools rather than genuine crisis responses. The timing tells the story. Third, what happens now sets precedent for every future presidency. Defending the system sometimes means opposing the person running it. Drop a comment with your thoughts on whether this revolt will hold or fade. Subscribe for coverage as this constitutional stress test continues.